Geneva, Switzerland, March 19, 2007. 7:43 in the morning. A maintenance worker at an upscale apartment building in the Eau Vive district unlocks the door to Unit 412 after neighbors complain about a smell. What he finds inside will trigger one of the most complex international manhunts in modern intelligence history. The apartment belongs to a man listed in building records as Michel Rousseau, a French consultant who traveled frequently for work. His body is on the living room floor, dead for approximately 72 hours, according to the medical examiner, who arrives 90 minutes later. Single gunshot wound to the back of the head. Professional execution. No signs of struggle, no robbery. Nothing taken except possibly documents, though it's impossible to know what was there originally. Swiss federal police treat it as a targeted killing and begin standard investigation procedures. But something about this murder catches the attention of someone who shouldn't even be in Switzerland. A Mossad officer operating under diplomatic cover at the Israeli mission in Geneva has a contact within Swiss law enforcement, a relationship built over years through careful cultivation and mutual benefit on terrorism-related intelligence sharing. This contact mentions the murder casually over coffee, noting that the victim had an interesting travel history. Multiple trips to Beirut, Damascus, Tehran, cities where legitimate French consultants rarely conduct business. The Mossad officer asks for more details. When he receives the victim's passport information and photographs from the apartment, he immediately recognizes something that makes his blood run cold. Among the personal effects recovered from the scene are 3 books in Arabic, all published in Beirut in the 1980s. Technical manuals on explosives and firearms. And in one of these books, tucked between pages describing timer mechanisms for improvised explosive devices, is a black and white photograph. The photograph shows 2 men at what appears to be a training camp. One man is clearly the victim, Michel Rousseau, though much younger, perhaps in his mid-20s. The other man in the photograph is someone Mossad knows very well. Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, Carlos the Jackal, the world's most notorious terrorist for hire, captured in Sudan in 1994 and imprisoned in France ever since. But this photograph suggests something Israeli intelligence had suspected but never confirmed, that Carlos's network, his training methods, his operational philosophy hadn't died when he was captured. Someone had continued his work, and that someone had just been executed in Geneva, which meant either the Successor had betrayed someone powerful enough to order his killing, or there was infighting within what remained of Carlos's organization. Either scenario presented both danger and opportunity for Israeli intelligence. To understand what Mossad was dealing with, you need to understand who Carlos the Jackal actually was and why his methods terrified intelligence agencies for 2 decades. Born in Venezuela in 1949, Ilich Ramirez Sanchez was named after Vladimir Ilich Lenin by his communist father. He received training in Cuba and at the Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow, where Soviet intelligence identified promising revolutionaries who could be useful for operations the USSR wanted conducted without direct involvement. Carlos became the perfect international terrorist. He had no fixed ideology beyond vague anti-imperialism. He worked for whoever paid him. He conducted operations for Palestinian groups, Libyan intelligence, East German Stasi, Syrian intelligence services. He was responsible for bombings in France, the seizure of OPEC ministers in Vienna, assassinations across Europe, and attacks on Israeli and Jewish targets that made him one of Mossad's most wanted individuals throughout the 1970s and 80s. What made Carlos particularly dangerous wasn't just his willingness to kill, it was his methodology. He built networks of safe houses, weapons caches, and support personnel across multiple countries. He trained operatives in specialized skills like surveillance detection, cover identity creation, and operational security. He understood how to exploit gaps in international cooperation, moving between countries that didn't share intelligence with each other. And he documented everything. Carlos was meticulous about recording his methods, his training procedures, his operational philosophy. When he was finally captured in 1994, after French intelligence located him in Sudan and essentially kidnapped him with Sudanese government cooperation, authorities found extensive files detailing his network's structure. But they also found evidence that Carlos had trained dozens of other operatives over the years. Most were captured or killed in the decade following his arrest. But intelligence agencies suspected that at least a few had disappeared, gone dormant, waiting for the right opportunity or client to resume operations. The man killed in Geneva, Michel Rousseau, whose real name turned out to be Farid al-Masri, a Lebanese national who'd acquired French citizenship through fraudulent documents, was one of these dormant operatives. Mossad's records showed he'd been flagged in 1987 during surveillance of a suspected training camp in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, but he'd disappeared before they could action the intelligence. Now he was dead, executed, and the question was whether he'd been operating alone or whether he'd trained someone else, someone who was now carrying on Carlos's legacy. The answer came from an unexpected source 2 months after the Geneva murder. Tokyo, Japan, May 7, 2007. A Japanese businessman named Takeshi Yamamoto is shot 3 times while walking to his car in an underground parking garage near his office in the Shibuya district. Yamamoto survives, but is critically injured. Japanese police investigate and discover that Yamamoto isn't just a businessman. He's actually an intelligence officer with Japan's Public Security Intelligence Agency, working undercover to monitor North Korean operations in Japan. The assassination attempt appears to be North Korean retaliation for a recent investigation that exposed their smuggling networks. Japanese intelligence requests assistance from allied agencies in tracking whoever conducted the operation. They provide ballistic evidence from the recovered bullets. The weapon was a Tokarev TT-33 pistol, a Soviet-designed firearm common in East Asia. But the forensic examination reveals something unusual. The pistol had been professionally modified with a suppressor threading that wasn't standard Soviet manufacturing. The modification work showed extremely high-quality machining, the kind of custom work done by specialized armorers, not mass-produced modifications. Japanese intelligence shares this information through established intelligence liaison channels, including with Mossad, even though Israel and Japan don't have extensive intelligence cooperation. The liaison happens through American intermediaries who maintain relationships with both agencies. When Mossad's weapons specialists see the forensic reports and photographs of the bullet markings, they recognize the modification pattern. It matches techniques documented in one of Carlos the Jackal's training manuals, specifically a manual on weapons modification that had been recovered from one of his safe houses in Damascus in 1991. The manual described precise methods for threading Soviet-era pistols to accept suppressors, methods that differed from standard practices and left distinctive tool marks. These marks matched what Japanese forensics had found on the weapon used in Tokyo. This connection seemed almost impossible. Why would someone trained in Carlos's methods be conducting an assassination for North Korean interests in Tokyo? The target wasn't Israeli or Jewish. The operation had no connection to Middle Eastern politics. It didn't fit any known pattern of Carlos's historical operations, unless the connection wasn't ideological, unless whoever was operating had adopted Carlos's methods but was working as a pure mercenary, conducting operations for whoever paid, regardless of political affiliation or target. That would make them extraordinarily dangerous because it meant they had no predictable pattern based on ideology or geography. Mossad's Psychological Warfare and Special Operations Division, known internally as Lohama Psychologit, took over the investigation. Their mandate was building a comprehensive profile of who they were hunting based on the limited evidence available. They started with the Geneva murder victim, Farid al-Masri. Complete background investigation revealed he'd been living in France since 1998, under his false identity. He worked as a legitimate consultant for petroleum companies, which provided cover for extensive travel across the Middle East and North Africa. His financial records showed regular deposits from various consulting contracts, all appearing legitimate, but forensic accounting revealed irregularities, occasional large deposits that didn't correspond to any documented consulting work. These deposits, ranging from 50,000 to 200,000 euros, appeared every 12 to 18 months, payment for something that wasn't consulting. The deposits came from shell companies registered in Cyprus, Liechtenstein, and Panama, standard money laundering structures. Tracing beneficial ownership was nearly impossible, but Mossad's Financial Intelligence Unit identified patterns in how the money moved. The shell companies received funds from accounts in Lebanon, Syria, and Iran, then filtered the money through multiple jurisdictions before paying al-Masri. The amounts and timing suggested payment for completed operations, not ongoing retainers. Each deposit followed within weeks of significant incidents. A bombing in Beirut that killed a Lebanese politician who'd been cooperating with Western intelligence. An assassination in Damascus targeting a Syrian opposition figure. A weapons shipment intercepted in Iraq that killed 2 American soldiers when it exploded during inspection. The timing was circumstantial, not proof, but it suggested al-Masri had been active far more recently than Mossad had realized, and if he was operating, training manuals and old photographs suggested he'd likely trained at least one protege. Mossad reached out to 5 intelligence agencies through carefully structured liaison channels that protected sources and maintained operational security. French DGSE, German BND, British MI6, American CIA, and Italian AISE. They provided limited information about what they were investigating, described the technical signature from the Tokyo operation, and asked if any agency had encountered similar patterns in unsolved cases. The responses took weeks, but eventually provided crucial information. The British reported an unsolved assassination in London in 2005. A Russian businessman with suspected intelligence connections shot with a modified Makarov pistol, showing similar suppressor threading. The Germans reported a bombing in Hamburg in 2006 targeting a Turkish political activist. The explosive device used timing mechanisms described in Carlos's training manuals. The French reported an attempted assassination in Marseille in 2004. The target survived, described the attacker as male, approximately 35 to 40 years old, Middle Eastern or Mediterranean appearance, fluent in French with no detectable accent. This description became the foundation of Mossad's profile. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Argentina's intelligence service, Secretaría de Inteligencia, contacted Israeli intelligence through back channels in August 2007. They had information that might be relevant to an investigation Mossad was conducting, though they didn't specify how they knew Mossad was investigating anything. Argentine intelligence had been monitoring suspected Hezbollah financing networks in Buenos Aires, where Lebanon's Shia community included individuals with connections to the militant organization. During surveillance of a currency exchange business in the once neighborhood, known for Middle Eastern immigrant communities, they observed an individual matching the description Mossad had circulated through liaison channels. Male, late 30s, Mediterranean appearance, conducting multiple large currency exchanges over several days. The individual converted approximately 400,000 US dollars into euros and Brazilian reais through transactions structured to avoid reporting requirements. Argentine surveillance teams followed him to an apartment in the Palermo district. They observed him entering the building, but didn't approach because they wanted to coordinate with Israeli intelligence if this was indeed the person Mossad was tracking. Mossad dispatched a team within 48 hours. The team included surveillance specialists, technical officers capable of covert entry operations, and Arabic-speaking interrogators in case direct contact became necessary. They coordinated with Argentine intelligence, who agreed to provide support while maintaining deniability if the operation went wrong. The apartment was a short-term rental paid for with cash. No lease, no official record beyond a notation in the building's visitor log. The target had represented himself as a Brazilian businessman in Buenos Aires for commercial meetings. He'd been there for 6 days, which meant if he followed patterns from previous operations, he'd likely leave soon. Mossad's team made the decision to conduct a covert entry while the target was out of the apartment. Argentine intelligence provided counter-surveillance to ensure they weren't observed. 2 technical officers picked the lock and entered the apartment at 2:17 in the afternoon while the target was at a restaurant 3 blocks away. What they found inside was extraordinary. The apartment contained operational materials that confirmed this was indeed someone trained in Carlos's methodology. 3 false passports from different countries, all with the same photograph but different names. A laptop computer with files encrypted using military-grade software. A modified Beretta 92 pistol with the same suppressor threading pattern seen in Tokyo. And documents, printed files detailing what appeared to be surveillance of multiple targets across the Middle East. The documents included photographs, addresses, daily routines, security details. One file was labeled Tehran Operation and contained information about an Iranian nuclear scientist. Another was labeled Beirut Target and showed surveillance of a Hezbollah commander. A third file, labeled Jerusalem Contingency, contained information about Israeli government buildings and security procedures. This suggested the Successor wasn't just continuing Carlos's work as a mercenary, he was actively planning operations against Israeli targets. Mossad faced a critical decision. They could attempt to capture the Successor in Buenos Aires with Argentine cooperation, but that risked diplomatic complications and might fail if the target detected surveillance and escaped. Or they could let him continue his travel and set up a controlled operation where they had better infrastructure and support. They chose the controlled operation. The laptop recovered from the Buenos Aires apartment, which Mossad's technical team copied before leaving everything exactly as they'd found it, contained encrypted communications with a contact in Europe. Mossad's Signals Intelligence Unit broke the encryption within 72 hours. The communications revealed that the Successor was planning to acquire specialized weapons from an arms dealer in Paris. The meeting was scheduled for September 15, 2007, at a hotel in the 6th arrondissement. This presented perfect opportunity. Mossad could substitute their own operative for the arms dealer, control the meeting location, and either capture the Successor or at minimum gather intelligence about his current operations and future plans. The risk was substantial. If the Successor detected the substitution, he'd disappear again, possibly for years. If the operation failed violently, Israeli intelligence officers could be killed or captured in France, creating diplomatic crisis. But the intelligence value justified the risk. Mossad coordinated with French DGSE through liaison channels that maintained plausible deniability. The French provided logistical support without officially acknowledging an Israeli operation on their territory. The hotel chosen for the meeting was Le Saint James, a small boutique property where Mossad could control the environment. They rented the entire floor where the meeting would occur, placed surveillance equipment in adjacent rooms, and positioned a tactical team in the basement with rapid access to the meeting location. The operative playing the arms dealer was David Levi. I'm using a false name because his actual identity remains classified, a Mossad officer with extensive experience in undercover operations. Levi had built a cover identity over 5 years as an arms broker operating in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. He had real contacts in the arms trade, had conducted actual transactions that established his credibility, and could discuss weapon specifications with the technical knowledge expected of a genuine dealer. September 15th arrived. Levi positioned himself in the hotel room at the designated time, 3 in the afternoon. The Successor arrived 17 minutes late, standard operational security, to observe whether the location showed signs of surveillance or setup. He knocked on the door. Levi opened it and invited him inside. What followed was 90 minutes of negotiation that Mossad recorded from multiple angles. The Successor, using the name Ahmed Hassan, though certainly not his real identity, wanted to acquire specialized weapons. Specifically, he needed explosive materials that wouldn't be detected by standard security screening and detonators that could be triggered remotely using cellular signals. These weren't weapons for simple assassination. These were weapons for bombing operations against hardened targets. The Paris meeting went catastrophically wrong in the final minutes. Levi had maintained his cover perfectly throughout the negotiation. He'd demonstrated knowledge of weapons technology, discussed suppliers, negotiated prices, established delivery timelines. The Successor seemed satisfied, but as the meeting concluded and they were finalizing arrangements for the weapons transfer, something triggered the Successor's suspicion. Perhaps a micro-expression that revealed Levi's tension, perhaps a detail in the cover story that didn't quite align, perhaps instinct developed through years of operational work. The Successor stood abruptly, his hand moving toward a concealed weapon. Levi reacted immediately, shouting the code word that brought Mossad's tactical team crashing through the door within seconds. But those seconds were enough. The Successor fired 2 shots that shattered the window behind Levi, then dove through the broken window onto the fire escape. He was 4 floors up, but the fire escape provided access to the adjacent building's roof. Mossad's tactical team pursued, but the Successor had planned his escape route. He crossed 3 rooftops, descended through a maintenance access in a building 2 blocks from the hotel, and disappeared into the Paris metro system before Mossad could establish a perimeter. French police were notified, but without official acknowledgement of what had actually happened, their response was limited to standard alert for a suspect who'd fled a disturbance. The Successor had escaped, but Mossad had gathered crucial intelligence. The hotel room recording provided voice samples that could be analyzed for language patterns and accent markers. The security cameras captured clear facial images that could be distributed through intelligence networks. And most importantly, they knew what weapons he was trying to acquire, which suggested imminent operations. Mossad's analysis unit determined the Successor would need to acquire those weapons elsewhere since the Paris source was now compromised. They identified 3 likely alternatives, all based in Eastern Europe, where arms trafficking from former Soviet stockpiles remained active. The most probable was a Ukrainian network, operating out of Prague, that specialized in explosives and detonators. Mossad surveillance detected the Successor's travel pattern within 48 hours. He had flown from Paris to Frankfurt using a German passport under yet another false name, then taken a train to Prague. He was continuing his weapons acquisition despite the failed Paris meeting, which suggested whatever operation he was planning had an imminent deadline. Mossad deployed teams to Prague, coordinating with Czech intelligence service Bezpečnostní informační služba. The cooperation was delicate because Czech Republic maintained relationships with countries that Israel considered hostile, but they shared concern about uncontrolled weapons trafficking. The Successor checked into a hotel near Prague's Old Town Square. Mossad established surveillance positions covering all exits. They tracked him to meetings with 2 individuals identified as members of the Ukrainian arms trafficking network. But before Mossad could set up an interdiction operation, the Successor detected the surveillance. He identified the pattern of vehicles following him and recognized repeating faces in crowds. The Successor fled Prague within hours of detecting surveillance, traveling to Budapest by train, then to Bucharest by bus, using multiple identity changes and anti-surveillance techniques that demonstrated his training. Mossad teams struggled to maintain contact. Traditional physical surveillance was compromised because he'd identified their methods. They needed a technological solution that wouldn't require maintaining visual contact. The breakthrough came from Unit 8200, Mossad's Signals Intelligence and Cyber Operations Division. They'd analyzed the laptop data recovered from Buenos Aires and identified the Successor's communication patterns. He used encrypted messaging applications, changed devices frequently, and employed sophisticated operational security. But he had one vulnerability. He maintained contact with a small network of facilitators who provided logistical support, safe houses, documents, and financial services. These facilitators weren't trained intelligence operatives. They were criminals operating for profit, and criminals are less disciplined about communication security. Unit 8200 identified 3 facilitators. Through pattern analysis of communications data, they hacked the phone of one facilitator, a Lebanese document forger operating in Istanbul, who'd provided the Successor with at least 4 sets of false passports over the past 3 years. This phone contained text message exchanges with the Successor discussing a meeting in Istanbul to acquire new documents. The meeting was scheduled for October 3, 2007. This gave Mossad 2 weeks to prepare. But they also had a new capability. Unit 8200 had developed malware specifically designed to compromise the type of encrypted phone the Successor was using. If they could get physical access to his device for just 90 seconds, they could install the malware without leaving detectable traces. Once installed, the malware would provide real-time location tracking, access to communications, and the ability to remotely activate the phone's microphone and camera. The challenge was getting 90 seconds of physical access. They couldn't simply steal the phone because he'd immediately acquire a new device. They needed to access it while he still possessed it, install the malware, and return it without his knowledge. Mossad planned an operation for the Istanbul meeting. They identified the location where the document forger typically met clients, a cafe in the Beyoğlu district. They positioned a team, including a specialist trained in covert device manipulation, someone who could access a phone, install software, and return it within the window of opportunity. October 3rd arrived. The Successor met the document forger at the cafe as scheduled. They sat at an outdoor table. The forger presented sample documents for the Successor's inspection. While they were discussing specifications and prices, Mossad's specialist, posing as a waiter, created a distraction by accidentally spilling water on the table. Both men instinctively moved their belongings to avoid the water. In that moment of confusion, the specialist swapped the Successor's phone with an identical device preloaded with malware. The original phone was taken to a nearby vehicle where a technical team installed the malware in 73 seconds, then returned it to the specialist, who swapped it back during a second interaction when he returned with towels to clean the spilled water. The entire operation took less than 5 minutes. The Successor never suspected his device had been compromised. Once the malware was installed, Unit 8200 had complete access to the Successor's communications and location. Over the following 2 weeks, they intercepted his messages, tracked his movements, and finally understood the full scope of what he was planning. He'd been contracted by Iranian intelligence to conduct an operation against an Israeli target. The specific target was an Israeli diplomat scheduled to attend a conference in Beirut, Lebanon, in late October. The operation was designed to be spectacular, a bombing that would kill the diplomat and potentially dozens of others attending the conference, sending a message that Israeli officials weren't safe anywhere in the Middle East. The timeline was urgent. The conference was scheduled for October 24th. The Successor was already in Beirut conducting final surveillance and preparing the explosive device using materials he'd acquired through the Ukrainian network he'd contacted in Prague. Mossad faced an impossible situation. They needed to prevent the attack, but conducting a military or intelligence operation in Beirut was extraordinarily difficult. Lebanon's government was weak, dominated by Hezbollah's influence in many areas. Iranian intelligence had strong presence in Beirut, and the Palestinian refugee camps hosted militant groups hostile to Israel. Israeli intelligence technically wasn't supposed to operate in Lebanon at all, following the 1982 invasion and subsequent occupation that ended in 2000. Any Israeli operation that was detected would create international incident and strengthen Hezbollah's political position by allowing them to claim Israeli violation of Lebanese sovereignty. But the intercepted communications made clear the attack was imminent and would kill Israeli personnel. Doing nothing wasn't an option. Mossad developed a plan that relied on the one asset they had in Lebanon that provided plausible deniability: the Lebanese forces, a Christian militia that had fought alongside Israel during the Civil War and maintained covert cooperation despite officially distancing themselves from Israeli connections. The Lebanese forces operated primarily in Christian areas of Beirut and the surrounding mountains. They had limited reach into neighborhoods where Hezbollah dominated. But the Successor, according to his tracked location, was operating from a safe house in the Hamra district, a mixed area where Lebanese forces had enough presence to conduct an operation if properly supported. Mossad contacted Lebanese forces leadership through intermediaries that obscured Israeli involvement. They provided intelligence about a foreign operative planning a major bombing in Beirut, carefully framing it as a threat to Lebanese stability rather than specifically an Israeli concern. The Lebanese forces agreed to conduct the operation. On October 20th, 4 days before the scheduled conference, a team of Lebanese forces operatives raided the safe house. The operation was quick and violent. The Successor was armed and resisted. He wounded one Lebanese forces operative before being subdued. The safe house contained the partially assembled explosive device, weapons, surveillance photographs of the conference venue, and documents detailing the planned operation. What happened to the Successor after his capture in Beirut remains one of the most classified aspects of this entire operation. Official records don't acknowledge his capture. Lebanese authorities never announced an arrest. No trial occurred. No prison record exists. He simply disappeared. What's known through carefully sourced reporting by investigators who've studied this operation is that the Successor was interrogated for approximately 72 hours at a location in the mountains outside Beirut, controlled by Lebanese forces. Mossad officers weren't present during the interrogation to maintain deniability, but they provided questions through Lebanese forces intermediaries. The information extracted during this interrogation was extensive. The Successor revealed he'd been trained by Farid al-Masri, the man killed in Geneva. Beginning in 1998, after al-Masri identified him as a promising recruit. His real name was Hassan al-Turki, a Syrian national who'd fled to Lebanon during Syria's political upheavals. He'd conducted 11 operations over 9 years for various clients, including Iranian intelligence, Syrian intelligence, Hezbollah, and several Palestinian militant groups. The operations ranged from assassinations to bombings to weapons smuggling facilitation. He'd killed at least 23 people directly and facilitated operations that killed hundreds more. The intelligence about his network led to follow-up operations across 3 continents. Financial accounts were seized, safe houses were raided, facilitators were arrested. The document forger in Istanbul was detained by Turkish authorities. The Ukrainian arms traffickers in Prague were targeted by Czech intelligence. The entire infrastructure that had supported his operations was systematically dismantled. As for al-Turki himself, multiple sources suggest he was transferred to Israeli custody through methods that left no official record. He was likely taken from Lebanon by sea, transported to Israel, and held at a facility where high-value intelligence sources are debriefed for months or years. His current status is unknown. The Israeli diplomat who'd been targeted in Beirut attended the conference as scheduled, never knowing how close he'd come to being killed. The conference proceeded without incident. The bombing that would have killed dozens never happened, and the public never learned that an operation had been planned, let alone prevented. This is how intelligence operations actually conclude. Not with dramatic announcements or public trials, but with silence. Operations are prevented that no one knows were planned. Threats are neutralized that the public never hears about. And people disappear into classified detention facilities where they're either eventually released after years of debriefing or they remain imprisoned indefinitely under circumstances that are never publicly acknowledged. The operation to track and capture the Jackal's successor took 7 months from the initial lead in Geneva to the final capture in Beirut. It involved Mossad operations in 8 countries, coordination with 6 foreign intelligence agencies, and the deployment of dozens of officers across 3 continents. The cost was estimated at over $15 million. The intelligence value was immeasurable because it prevented not just one attack, but dismantled an entire network that had operated successfully for nearly a decade. And here's what makes this operation particularly significant for understanding modern intelligence work. The Successor was never captured through dramatic confrontation or conventional police work. He was tracked through patient intelligence gathering, technical surveillance, international cooperation, and the exploitation of a single vulnerability in his operational security. The malware, installed on his phone in Istanbul, provided the capability that made everything else possible. Without that 90-second window of access in a cafe, without the technical sophistication to compromise an encrypted device, without the ability to track his location and intercept his communications in real time, the operation would have failed. The methods used to track the Jackal's successor represent the future of intelligence work in the 21st century. The combination of human intelligence, signals intelligence, cyber operations, and international cooperation creates capabilities that individual operatives can't evade no matter how well trained they are. Carlos the Jackal operated successfully for 2 decades because the technology to track him didn't exist and international cooperation was limited by Cold War divisions. His successor operated for 9 years, but the evolving capabilities of modern intelligence eventually found him. The next generation of threats will require even more sophisticated methods because adversaries learn from each failure and adapt their techniques. But this operation proved something fundamental about intelligence work that remains true regardless of technology. The most sophisticated operative still has vulnerabilities. The most careful tradecraft still leaves traces, and the most secure communications eventually get compromised. Al-Turki believed he was operating with the same invisibility that had protected Carlos for decades. He used multiple identities, changed locations constantly, employed counter-surveillance techniques, and maintained strict operational security. But he couldn't account for the cumulative effect of modern intelligence capabilities working in coordination across multiple agencies and continents. Every transaction left a digital footprint. Every communication created metadata. Every movement through surveillance-saturated cities captured images that facial recognition could analyze. The world had changed in ways that made his methodology, inherited from Cold War-era training, increasingly obsolete. And somewhere in a classified facility, the intelligence he provided during his debriefing continues to inform operations against networks he once served. His capture didn't just prevent one attack, it provided a map of an entire ecosystem of facilitators, financiers, arms dealers, and clients who thought they were operating invisibly. That intelligence will shape counterterrorism operations for years, preventing attacks that would have killed hundreds, disrupting networks that would have conducted dozens of operations, and demonstrating that even the most elusive threats eventually encounter the reach of modern intelligence capabilities. This is the reality of 21st century intelligence work. Not the glamorous version portrayed in entertainment, but the patient accumulation of fragments that eventually form complete pictures. The coordination across agencies that overcomes jurisdictional limitations, the technology that turns human vulnerabilities into operational access, and the silence that follows success, because the most effective operations are the ones nobody knows happened at all.